I study extreme flood events, so a bit broader than hurricanes. I'm working on two projects, one in South Carolina in response to Joaquin in Colombia, and also an extreme flood, about 20 inches of rain that hit Colorado in 2013. And what I'm interested in is, one, do communities learn from these experiences? If they do, what do they learn? And what motivates them to change? Is it extreme damage? Is it resources? Is it push from the public, etc.? And my other question, more broadly, is what do residents who experience floods react? How do they view risks going forward? Does this change their kind of worldview on how they view climate change, how they view flood risks, and what should be done about them? So that's the perspective that I'm going to take. So in Colorado and in South Carolina, we did a large number of surveys by different modes. So in Colorado, it was more internet and mail-based. In South Carolina, Bass Connections gave us money to take down the Duke Research Mobile and sat it in the parking lot of a Piggly Wiggly in an area that had experienced floods. And we took volunteers and interviewed them and surveyed them about their experiences post-disaster. So, and this is where my pessimism comes in. Now, in ideal research design, you would survey people before a flood, ask them their thoughts. The flood would happen, survey them after. We can't really do this. We don't know where floods are going to occur. So what we do is more cross-sectional, looking at and comparing people who have experienced floods versus those who haven't, direct experience damage, etc. And what we found is people whose personal properties, homes, were damaged by floods have a much lower perception of future flood risks than those who did not experience floods. So you experience a flood, you don't think, oh, another one's coming. You think perhaps one line of thought is, I experienced this flood, we're done. It's not going to happen again for a long time. Right? So again, this gets to the question perhaps of, are we going to be able to learn and change if people's beliefs are, this isn't a problem going forward, it's hit me once, and that's it. And then demographics. One thing that, and I'm really interested in the how vulnerable communities of color, low SES, females, etc., experience floods. And we're seeing that men have a much lower risk perception of floods than women do. That pretty much stays with the literature on flood risks. But what hasn't been talked much in the literature is the role of land tenure, or land ownership, home ownership. And oftentimes that's a hard community to reach out to post-floods. People in apartments often move elsewhere after a flood pretty quickly. And we were able to get to these communities because we were on the ground pretty quickly after the flood in South Carolina, Joaquin. And we found that of all home ownership versus people that live in apartments, the people in the apartments feel themselves much more vulnerable, see flooding as a much higher risk than people that own homes. Right, so an interesting thing that hasn't really been discussed. And then asking questions about, what do you think, will you be able to recover? Right, how knowledgeable now do you feel about flood risks? Do you feel informed? Do you have access to resources? Do you have access to local governments? And here we're seeing low SES, kind of under-resourced both communities, individuals in under-resourced communities, and under-resourced individuals themselves are feeling less informed about risks about floods and less prepared about floods as compared to higher SES and more resourced communities. So again, differentiation of perception of flood risks based on level of resources, access to local government officials. And then we get to beliefs about climate change, okay? There's been a big Twitter debate out there. Should we be talking about, in a normative sense, climate change post these floods? Is this a window of opportunity to push for climate change action? Ideally, in my mind, yes. I think it is a window of opportunity. We can make some change to FEMA's flood insurance, etc. But does experiencing a flood affect people's beliefs about man-made climate change? Not really. At least that's what my studies have shown. And if anything, it's at the personal level a negative effect. The two main drivers in my research and other research that are drivers of belief, and I don't even really like that term belief in climate change, but we'll go with that, is political affiliation, gender, to some extent age, and education, but primarily gender, political affiliation, with floods maybe having a marginal effect there. And then we've looked more broadly at community level changes. And we followed in Colorado 7 communities over a 3-year period, conducting interviews every year with local officials. We studied 1,800 documents that were produced by the communities looking for policy changes, conducted surveys, etc. And what we found in general is there's really a tension, and we're talking at the local level, between recovering fast, getting things rebuilt quickly so people can return to normalcy, and rebuilding what I would say well or more resiliently, being more thoughtful about where we should develop, how we should develop, what should go on in the floodplains. Those processes take time and resources to really think and reform goals and objectives about becoming more resilient. And there's a lot of pressure to, boulder strong. Let's be strong. Let's build back quickly without thinking long term. Now, there is some caveats there. One town that was, I would say, a catastrophic flooding has engaged in a long-term collaborative public engagement processes, and we're really seeing policy changes on where development is occurring and is not occurring, use of parks and floodplains versus homes, etc. But we're also, and they were pretty highly resourced community prior to the extreme flood. And a lower resource community, we don't see that, we're not seeing that happen. So it really matters not only the extent of damage caused by an extreme event or a hurricane, but also the state of the community financially, resource-wise, before the storm event occurred, in terms of what comes out afterwards. Some other things they've learned is, one, federal reimbursement processes take a lot of effort, take human capacity, need to hire staff in order to process all of the reimbursement. And cities generally are expected to put up a 12.5% cost share for FEMA money. Oftentimes communities don't have that if they were extremely damaged. So then they have to think of how are they going to do reimbursements, how are they going to put out development plans based on these financial constraints. And yeah, 12.5. And so what some of the communities have learned is keeping a rainy day fund or having their own source of fund outside of FEMA to become more independent of federal flows of cash. There's like 18 different programs in Colorado, federal monies post-disaster. That was really important in making resilient decisions post-recovery. So towns that had a greater cash flow to begin with, and also the ability to get external funds to help them from a number of different sources. Thank you. I do a lot of this work with a professor in Colorado for the Colorado Project. It's been funded by NSF and Fast Connections. So, questions?
What is the gender difference in belief in global climate change?
That women are much more to point or believe in human cause than men.
And education level, they
Education,
It did?
yeah, increase education, increase belief.
So the male was more educated, did he have more probability of believing man-made?
I don't believe we did interactions between gender and education. Other questions? Yes.
Let me know if it's not the best question for you, but so even if you can't scientifically link hurricanes to climate change, is it still the understanding among scientists that that link is definitely there?
You know, I would say, my view is that it's going to, there has to be a relationship, maybe not for these particular storms, but a warm ocean has to produce more powerful storms.
More powerful storms, but not necessarily more storms.
No, more powerful.
More powerful.
The frequency is a different matter.
Right. The intensity,
Yeah.
the amount of rainfall. But again, that, it's a statistical question of, is this an outlier or not, as Susan was talking about. Yeah, and I was going to ask Susan this question. I often talk about the steroid baseball metaphor. I don't know if you've all heard that, right? If you're on steroids, you may be able to hit the ball farther and hit, home runs way out the park, but can you put that particular home run, link that to being on steroids? Probably not, right? So it's, that may be, there's some flaws in that metaphor, but that's one way to think about it. Other thoughts?
For the under-resourced households that perceive themselves, I guess, less prepared, did you all then check in with their politicians, their representatives, to see whether or not there was any effort to educate them, I guess?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. One of the communities that we looked at had a high percentage of undocumented immigrants, which were very vulnerable post-flood, and most left and didn't check in with local government or FEMA for fear of having to document themselves and getting into trouble. And so that's a major, and that's one of my questions in terms of Harvey and Irma, in terms of undocumented. Given the current political context, I have some concerns there. But yes, I think they're trying, at least the local officials that we talk to reach out to communities, thinking different ways on how to do that. Some are holding neighborhood meetings, trying to get away from just posting things on Facebook and tweeting, recognizing that not everyone Facebooks, not everyone tweets, not everyone English is their first language. And so thinking of other ways to reach those groups to help.
Did you find in cases like you mentioned in Boulder, Colorado, that they wanted to build back stronger and that big push to build back quickly? Did you find that they were thinking long term when they?
So Boulder specifically, yes. Out of all the communities, Boulder, and all the communities in Colorado that we've looked at, has a push to become more resilient. And they actually had less damages from this 20 inches of rain because their areas along stream beds, creek beds, river beds are mostly open space and trails versus because of their pretty strict land use policies prior. So even with that, they're thinking more towards kind of resilience. What would resilient infrastructure look like? They have the city government building right in the floodplain that was hurt. Like, okay, let's look at the resources in the floodplain. Can we move them out? What should the role of, or what should the use of floodplains be? Same was true in Lyons, Colorado. Less so and those are two pre-flood, highly resourced communities. Less so in communities in Weld County in Colorado, which is more blue-collar oil industry. So kind of a different kind of economic base, and two, a different demographic and different political culture. So.
Do you see that North Carolina builds back stronger and better?
Yeah, that's
floods here, even in the Triangle. And what are you seeing here?
What am I seeing here? That's an excellent question. I don't see a lot of evidence of huge policy changes in the face of extreme flood events. That's a very non-nuanced, overarching statement, which needs nuance. And I'm hoping in the spring to look and start following post-Matthew communities to see what's going on. I know there's some buyout programs going on, Princeville, some things going on there as well. So hopefully I'll be more in touch with North Carolina communities.
This may be an obvious answer here, but because you're talking about policy changes, so do you find that these politicians are more aligning with developers more so than the research that you're doing or other scientists are doing? Like, what are they basing these decisions on for building new infrastructure and changing things?
There definitely is a voice of development within the communities, but there's also, and we looked, one of the papers that's in draft right now, we're looking at coalition formations after these and what groups of community members, businesses, local organizations are pushing for post floods. And so I'd say that there's many voices, and those voices really depend on the demographics and the makeup and the economic base of that town itself.
Thank you, Professor Albright.
Thank you.